I'm Kay Krasno-Waterman. I am one of the organizing committee members here in New York, Sloan Fellow 06. And I'm thrilled that you're all here. I hope you're really enjoying it. I have been blown away by the people I've met in the last 24 hours. You know, you think you know really cool people, and then you come here and you meet more really cool people. So just curious, who's met somebody in the last 24 hours that they are going to keep in touch with after they leave here? Okay, if you didn't, you have to stay for the cocktail and get that done. All right. So I am really excited to introduce, this is a sort of a great window that I got to participate in. The entrepreneurship panel, amazing people, a bunch of whom I already know, and I hope you really enjoyed that. And I now get to introduce somebody I think is really special. Some of you may know Zeynep is a professor of practice at Sloan. She is from Turkey. She came to the United States on a scholarship as an undergrad and stayed, and like all of our MIT faculty, a doctorate from Harvard, because heaven forbid you should be any less, and has done really incredible work in the labor space and human resource space. She has done research about organizations and the people who work for organizations. And what you have her bio in the program, but what I think is so interesting is that 10 years ago and more, when most people were talking about how to make labor really cheap and how to really make it all very routinized, you know, so that people were practically machines, she was taking the opposite view, the contrarian view, and saying investing in people is really a major key to success. That investing in what they learn, how they're empowered, how they're paid, really makes a difference. And her research, if you look at the list of her research, it's just a who's who of the retail space. So Home Depot, Trader Joe's, Zara, like you think of a major retailer, it's probably on her research list. And from that work, she wrote a book. Many of you grabbed it off the tables at dinner last night, the Good Jobs Strategy, the red book. A bunch of people were lucky enough to get a free copy last night. And that led to more people reaching out to her, more companies reaching out to her, and the creation of a nonprofit called the Good Jobs Institute. And I'm really excited to hear her speak and to hear where we go from here, what new exciting things she has to say, and probably contrarian from the rest of industry. So please welcome Zeynep.
Thank you, Kay, for that introduction, and good afternoon. If you were in my class, I would ask you to come forward, and I would say, I promise I'm not going to cold call you, although I see some of my former students, and who knows, maybe I might ask a few things and see if they remember. I'm delighted to be here, and here's what I'm going to talk about. Last year, 47 million people in the United States, 47 million Americans, worked in jobs where the median wage was less than $15 an hour. That's more than a third of workforce. And $15 an hour might seem like a lot, but if you work like 35 hours a week, every single week, that's $26,000 a year. Not enough to take care of your family. This morning, I was in Atlanta, and I was talking to an industry, convenience chain industry, which employs 2.5 million of these 47 million workers. And the message that I gave to them is the message that I'm going to give to you, which is, if we want to create a strong middle class in the United States, and I think all of you here would agree that we so desperately need a stronger middle class in the United States, we can't do that by treating these jobs like retail, fast food, home care workers as just stepping stone to good jobs. We need to make these 47 million jobs good jobs themselves. And the people who work in jobs right now, they're angry, they're frustrated, they are longing for a sense of pride and dignity. And the good news is that transforming these bad jobs into good jobs is not only possible, but it can also be very profitable for companies. But doing that, especially in these low-wage sectors where the profit margins are very thin and competition is tough, doing that requires a lot of operational excellence. And that's the message, that if you want to have good jobs, especially in these types of settings, we have to pay attention to operations and operational excellence. Let me just go backwards and tell you how I came to this conclusion. So I'm in the operations management faculty at MIT Sloan. My background is retail supply chains. I started doing my research 20 years ago in retail supply chains and joined a group of researchers, and we were looking at how retailers can get the right product to the right store at the right time. And we were looking at data, algorithms, pricing, assortment optimization, inventory planning. And then during one of our conferences, the CEO of Office Depot at the time, he raised his hand and he said, you know, you supply chain academics are obsessed with data and analytics and planning. But guess what? Oftentimes, my retail supply chain gets the right product to the right store at the right time, and then no one can find it at the store because it's in the wrong place. Has this ever happened to you? You go into, just raise your hand if you've ever experienced this problem. Exactly. So he was talking about this 20 years ago. This is still a problem. He called it phantom stockouts. I studied this problem at Borders. Remember Borders? They're not with us anymore. A couple weeks ago in my MBA course, we did a case about them. They didn't go bankrupt because they did research with me just to get it out of the way. But then I started seeing problems like phantom stockouts, data inaccuracy, promotion non-compliance, all sorts of operational problems inside the retail stores. These problems were big, they were expensive, they hurt the supply chain, they hurt sales, they hurt labor productivity, they hurt shrink, they hurt cost, all sorts of ways. So the obvious question was, why do these problems happen all the time? Why are they so common? And one of the answers was because of the sheer operational complexity in these environments. But the other big driver was labor practices. Stores that had more employee turnover had more problems. Stores that had less training had more problems. Stores that just didn't have enough people to get all the work done had more problems. And in fact, what I found was that retailers, and I'm going to talk a lot about retailers, but since then I've been working with other companies as well, and the story is pretty similar, were finding themselves in a vicious cycle. And the vicious cycle starts with the mentality that people are a cost. Like everybody says people are our biggest asset and most valuable asset, but people don't show up in the balance sheet, they show up in the income statement as a cost. And if you are, I mean, that's what it is. And if you are in an industry with single and low single-digit profit margins, and cost minimization is so important, and you have this objective of minimizing labor costs, that forces the unit managers to cut those costs as much as possible. Because you have your whole performance management systems around cutting those costs, and that leads to underinvestment in people. Underinvestment in people leads to operational problems. Operational problems leads to lower sales, lower profits. What happens to labor budgets when sales decline? They shrink, right? And then this vicious cycle continues. So the only reason I studied this vicious cycle was because of my interest in retail supply chains and because it reduced profits. But then I started seeing the implications of this vicious cycle for workers. And that was, to be quite honest, heartbreaking. Like I came from the United States, from Turkey to the United States on a viable scholarship. This country has been so amazing to me. And I saw the United States, like many of my friends saw the United States, as a land of opportunity. But then when I started doing my research and started interviewing people, I realized, hey, work is not working for these people. And they were smart, they were competent, they were hardworking. Just to give you a picture of what work is like, first of all, wages. In the retail space, last year, the median wage was $11.33 an hour. That's it. And poverty level, right? And even if you work 40 hours a week, every single week, you still don't make enough money, but no one gets to work 40 hours a week every single week, even if you're a full-timer. Because 90% of the companies consider anyone who works 30 hours a week to be a full-timer, so your income can vary from like 30 hours of labor to 40 hours of labor from week to week. And not only does your income vary, your hours, your work schedules vary all the time. So most retailers provide their employees their work schedules 1 or 2 weeks in advance, and they can change in the last minute. And the hours are usually all over the place. Can you imagine like living a life where you don't know when you're gonna work next week? Can you imagine like if you're a single parent who's gonna take care of your child? Or can you imagine, I mean, I've interviewed so many workers, but one of them said to me, when I met her, she was working for this chain for 7 years. She was promoted several times, making $11.60 an hour, and she said, I can't get by, I can't take care of my kid, and I need to have another job, but I can't hold on to another job because my schedule changes all the time. And she said, and you know what? My income varies, but my bills don't. So that variability in income just hurts the low-wage workers in ways that we can't even imagine. And you mentioned routinizing work. One thing I heard over and over was how people felt like they didn't matter. One worker said to me, we are a dime a dozen, just human robots. And if you have an environment where people are treated this way, turnover is, of course, very high, right? My students will remember Jim Sinegal from Costco, the founder of Costco, who comes to class, and he says it's a fool's errand to think that you can hire somebody for $10 an hour, and they will stay with you for any time at all. They're gonna leave when they find something for 50 cents more per hour. And what's gonna happen in that environment is that your managers will be just focused on hiring the next warm body to work for you. And when they do that, they're fighting fires, and they're not managing their business anymore. And not surprisingly, in these environments with high turnover and a poor employee experience, it's almost impossible to provide a good customer experience. These are customer-facing environments, right? You go into a retail store, and you see the workers there, and they're interacting with you. And when you look at Yelp comments, Google comments, or American Customer Satisfaction Index, you see a lot of retailers to be scoring really low, because if you don't meet your basic needs of humans, employees, you won't meet the basic needs of customers. At least one nice thing with Amazon is that competition is getting stronger, and which means that now it's a customer's market, which means that for you to stay in business, you have to provide a compelling reason for your customers to come to your stores. So that's one driver of why some companies are changing now. They're finding this poor labor practices and bad customer experience unsustainable. The other reason why this is unsustainable is the labor markets. Right? We have tight labor markets now. It's hard to find good labor. It's hard to find people who want to work for you if you're paying them $10 an hour. And it's also hard when the minimum wages are increasing. So I'm hoping that 10 years from now, when we look at this industry, we are going to see lots of changes. And those companies that don't change, I don't think they're going to be with us any longer. Like, they should just look back the auto industry and look at what happened in the auto industry and learn from what happened in that auto industry, right? And if you think about Henry Ford's time, when the auto industry started, Henry Ford started this moving assembly line. It was amazing. Before, only wealthy people could afford car, but with the moving assembly line, there were so many efficiencies, and now a typical American could afford to buy a car. But in that assembly line, there was one weakness, which is it wasn't just parts that were interchangeable. People were also used as interchangeable parts. Work was so routinized. People didn't matter. Employee turnover was so high in that factory. In fact, Henry Ford was famous for saying, why is it that I have to hire a whole person when all I need is a pair of hands? But then what we learned in manufacturing, decades later, what we learned in manufacturing is using people as just a pair of hands is not the best way to make cars. Right? We learned when Toyota came in that if you invest in your people, if you invest in your processes, then the outcome is not just higher quality cars, but it's also lower cost cars. So Toyota showed us that you can break the trade-off between cost and quality if you invest in your people and if you invest in your operations. And that's exactly the type of change that we need in retail. And some retail and other in other industries where the investment in people is very low. And some companies have figured out exactly how to do that. I'll give you a couple examples of those companies that I've studied there in the book. But of course, the darling of good jobs in these sectors is Costco. Any Costco shoppers here? Right, so I go to Costco every weekend. Customers are fans, investors are fans. When I give presentations, I put a 10-year chart of Costco's performance versus S&P 500 and versus their biggest competitor, always outperforming. And the median wage of an hourly worker at a Costco warehouse this year, right now, is slightly $23 an hour. $23 an hour. Yes, I was trained at Harvard, but I know that that's higher than 1133. So Costco is one example of a company. I'll give you one other example that my students, I'm just looking at the two, and there's more here. Quick Trip is another example of a company, convenience store chain with gas stations. This morning, the Quick Trip CEO was there. It's like 7-Eleven, convenience store with gas stations, but the starting wage in Tulsa, Oklahoma for a full-timer is $42,000. At Quick Trip, their turnover is, of course, much lower. Their prices are just as low as anybody else's. And again, they have very satisfied customers. Oh, and by the way, their profits, per-store profits, are 89% higher than the top quartile in the convenience store chain industry. I'll give you another example. Mercadona, a Spanish supermarket chain. This is Spain's largest supermarket chain. And they have been growing, thriving at a time in Spain where so many companies are not. And when I met them, and this is, again, their low-cost leader, when I met them, I asked them, what is your employee turnover? And from the United States, I'm used to like 100%, 120% numbers. And they said 4%. And I'm like, maybe the Spanish people have a different way of calculating employee turnover. But then when you go to the stores and you ask people, how long have you been there? 20 years, 25 years. The store managers were telling me how many people they lost last year. Like, we lost 2 people last year. Why Mercadona pays double the minimum wage in Spain, and there's a bonus that people get every year. Mercadona invests 4 weeks of training, 100% internal promotion, just like Costco, just like Quick Trip. And also 85% of their employees are full-timers who get their schedules 1 month in advance and who work in shifts, so they have stability in their lives. So these were some examples of companies that had the combination of low prices, good jobs, and great performance for their investors. And the obvious question was, like, what do they do? How do they do this? And I so wish that the answer was, well, they just pay more, invest more in their workers, and then the world is a much better place. Then they attract the right people, they attract the right employees, they work harder, they stay longer, their turnover costs are lower, and that's the end of it. I wish that was the answer because it would be a very practical solution to our big economic problems. But the answer wasn't that. When I analyzed these companies, I saw that they have a whole different operating system than their competitors. It was so much like the contrast between Toyota production system and the GM or Ford production system. So on the one hand, they invested so much in their employees, not just in terms of wages and benefits, but also in terms of training, hiring, higher expectations. But on the other hand, these companies made a set of operational choices that increase the productivity of their employees and that increase the contribution of their employees and motivation of their employees at the same time. But these same operational choices that these companies made enabled that people investment. Because if you invest in something, you want high productivity, high return on that investment, so you have to create that type of productivity. But what I saw was that for them to be able to make those operational choices, they also had to invest in their people. Like, those operational choices did not work without having a highly motivated and capable workforce. In the book, since you all have free copies, if you don't have copies, don't buy one. You can go to our website, goodjobsinstitute.org, and we have lots of information about these choices. So I'm just the best promoter of my book. I say to people, my publisher loves me. But if you look at them, there are four operational choices that I saw that's common among them. I'm going to spend like a minute on each of those choices, and then and then move on because I want to hear your questions. That's more important than me just talking here. So the first choice that they had was the combination of strategic focus and operational simplification. Like so many companies try to be all things to all people, these companies were very clear about what they offered their customers, what they didn't offer their customers. And they simplified their operations along that lines. So I'll give you an example. If you go to a Mercadona store, a typical retail store carries 40,000 different products. 40,000 different products. A Mercadona store carries 9,000 products. A typical retail store, supermarket chain, they will change the prices all the time. Remember from your operations classes, when you change your prices, what happens to your supply chain? Like you introduce all sort of variability into your supply chains. So that's how a typical retailer operates. Mercadona keeps the prices steady. So what happens when you have fewer products and steady prices? That means that now your employees don't waste their time. They're a lot more productive when they're shelving merchandise. They're a lot more productive when they're checking people out. They're not only more productive, but they can also build expertise. Because now with fewer options and simpler operations, they can get to know their operations, they can get to know their products, and then they can shine in front of the customers. So one operational choice, simplification, improves their productivity, and it also improves their contribution because now they can talk to customers about those things. Another operational choice is the combination of standardization and empowerment. On the one hand, these companies standardize so many things, standardize so many routine processes, but then they empower their employees to make decisions. The type of decisions, I'll give you the opposite of empowerment. I was shopping at Whole Foods a while ago. And in Cambridge, we have to bring our own shopping bags to Whole Foods, right? Because otherwise, you have to pay for the bags. So one day, I bought one of those shopping bags, but it broke after first use. I went to Whole Foods the next time and asked the cashier, like, could you exchange this? It's like a $3 bag. And then she said, I have to ask my supervisor. And I'm like, really? So it was a Saturday. She asked her supervisor. In the meantime, I'm waiting. The other customers are waiting. She went and she spent the supervisor's time, her time. If you're paying people $15 an hour, this is not the best way to operate, right? But you see, this is the lack of empowerment, and the good jobs companies do the opposite. They would have changed my bag like this. What would that mean? That would mean speed for the customer, better service for the customer. What would that mean? Higher productivity for the employee, right? So that's the empowerment. The third thing that these companies do is cross-training. So if you go to a Trader Joe's store, and Trader Joe's is one of those companies I talk about, if there's a long line of customers at the checkout, somebody who's shelving merchandise, they will come and they'll open another register, right? Because they're cross-trained to do both customer-facing and non-customer-facing things so that they can react. This is a form of flexibility that you learned in your operations class. The fourth choice, which is my favorite choice, is what I call operate with Slack. So if you go to Costco, you'll see a lot of employees. Go to Trader Joe's, you'll see a lot of employees. You might not see that many products, like the product variety might be low, but there will be enough people to take care of you because these companies always err on the side of having too many rather than too few people. That way, people can do their jobs without making errors. That way, they can take care of the customer. That way, when they have ideas for improvement, they have time to identify, communicate, and act on those. But of course, operate with Slack can't work if you have slackers, right? So these companies, on the one hand, they make these operational choices, but on the other hand, they have high expectations of their employees. It's much harder to work at a Quick Trip store than at a 7-Eleven store. It's much harder to work at a Mercadona than a typical supermarket chain because the expectations are high. You have to come to play every time, and they have high performance standards, and they hire the right people. I mean, they do all those expectation stuff right. So this is the system that I call the good job strategy, which is a combination of those 4 operational choices and investment in people. And what I have found from the companies, and this is a limited set of companies, right? We don't have like hundreds of retailers doing this to be able to do quantitative studies. But when you look at them, you see that they do better financially, and they do better competitively. Financially, any metric that you look between these companies and others, productivity metric, customer satisfaction metric, or cost metric, they outperform their competitors. Sales per square foot, inventory turnover, et cetera. But perhaps more important than that, these companies have been able to differentiate themselves in the eyes of their customers, right? They offer their customers not just low prices, but also something else, right? They break those trade-offs between ors, and they say low prices and friendly, warm service. When you think about Trader Joe's, or when you think about Quick Trip, at the Quick Trip, it's all about quickness. The other strategic advantage that these companies have is that because they have great people and because they have good operations, they have this execution capability. So they can react to changes much faster than their competitors can. When the economic crisis hit Spain, Mercadona, from one year to the other, they dropped their prices by 10%. 10%, that's a huge deal. Not everybody was happy, but they did it. And guess what happened to their market share afterward? Right? They started capturing a lot more market share from others. That's the strategic advantage, that you can do things that your competitors cannot do. And one thing we know, technology changes, labor markets change, regulations change, what customers want change. So it is those companies who are able to adapt to changes who will stay with us for much longer. So you might be thinking, like, if this is so good, like, why do so few companies do this? Which is a very fair question. But I will say that right now, there are too many companies still treating their people as interchangeable parts, and too few companies doing what is called this good job strategy. And what I think it will take, and there's a movement, there's a slow movement, right? If you look at companies like Walmart, for example, during the last 4 years, Walmart raised their wages by about 50% for their starting employees. They've improved schedules, they are reducing their product variety, they're creating different technologies to improve the productivity of their store associates. Like, they're investing in their stores, and of course, slowly, these things take time, slowly they're seeing an impact. There's one retailer in Northwest that implemented the good job strategy, and it's been a great journey for them. And now, my MBA students don't know about it, but now we have a new case, and they come to class, and we discuss it. They raised wages by 30%. This is a company that had 2% profit margins. In 3 years, they raised wages by 30%. They increased the percentage of employees who work from more than 30 hours from 65% to 82%. And as a result, these people have benefits now. And at the same time, they reduced their prices. They did lots of operational changes. And it was a fantastic journey for them. And they're still seeing some of those benefits. So what will it take, like, for us to get more companies to operate this way? And I think it will take a lot of effort from all sorts of stakeholders, right? We think about business. That is not to say the government cannot play a role. And that is also not to say worker groups can't play a role. But let me just talk about the role of I'll just keep the government aside for the time being. But let me just focus on what I think it will take from the business community to get to more good jobs. I think it will take a lot of leadership to get there, and few excuses to get there. From the leadership, what do I mean? I mean, the first thing is we need competent leaders who can understand organizations as systems that work together. Because the good job strategy is a system. It has multiple elements, and you have to incorporate those elements. And when you're doing a transformation, you have to stay on that path and know how the elements work with one another. So competence is one. But the other is compassion and humility. Like, leaders don't have all the answers, right? There's this humility problem that I see where people tend to think that we can design everything from the top, and we can think about all the things that's going to happen. We can standardize everything from the top and just have the workers execute. The world doesn't work that way. When you meet leaders like Jim Sinegal, Costco's founder, you see how humble he is. And he wants to learn from the front line. He knows that they have, when it comes to improving their work, like, they have the answers. And I think along with humility comes with compassion. I'll give you one story which happened very recently. Jamie Dimon was on the he had this exchange, some of you might have seen it, with Katie Porter, the junior senator from California. And she grilled him, and she said, you know, your bank tellers, they're not making living wages, right? They're just not making enough money to be able to take care of your employees. And she said, okay, here's what you offer, what the wages in my county for this worker. And every month, she's $458 short. Every month, so what do you do about that? And he kept saying, I don't know, I have to think about it. I don't know, I have to think about it. And then he said, which is the part that drives me crazy, well, maybe one day she can have my job. And I'm thinking, yes, that's exactly what she has in mind too. So I think what we need is compassion. And for some companies, doing the right thing is actually economically very possible. Right? For some companies, paying people living wages is moral. Like if you think that you are a moral person and you want to do the right thing, it's actually quite possible. In the context of retail, where the labor costs are a huge percentage of their cost, like raising wages of $15 would get some companies into bankruptcy, right? Doing the right thing there is very hard, and it requires a lot of operational excellence. But in some other places, it's actually quite possible, but we need a little bit more compassion from our leaders to understand what the economic life is for the people who work for them. Maybe they visit their houses, maybe they see how they live, but we need that type of compassion. So I think we need the competence, we need the compassion and humility, and we need the courage and commitment. I mean, if a company transforms, we have a new paper that is almost accepted in organization science, and where we show that if a company wants to move from a bad job strategy to a good job strategy, then along the way, they're going to get some mixed signals. Things are going to get worse first. And if you have a culture of test and learn, and you run a 3-month experiment and see, is this working, you're going to get bad signals, and you're going to move away. Or if you are the type of leader where every time there's a performance pressure, the first thing you do is, what can be cut? This is not going to work. So we need leaders to have courage and commitment to this. We need leaders who have compassion and humility. And we need more leaders who have the competence to be able to execute something like this. And I think our MIT Sloan community is very well positioned for this. And I think it's going to be up to us to create an America where more people have good jobs. So thank you. And we have plenty of time for questions. Yes?
Hi. My name is Shana. I wonder if you've done some of this work in a nonprofit space, which historically pays sometimes less.
So one industry that we started working with at Good Jobs Institute is senior living. And one of the organizations that we're working with at this moment is a nonprofit who works in that space. They face very similar, maybe not on the investor side, but the journey looks quite similar for them as they do for-profit firms. But do you have something more?
Just wondering how you approach it, because the margins are sometimes smaller too, and just the capacity to, you're in the grind so much to step back and think about strategy is hard for a number of nonprofits.
The one difference I will say is when a for-profit company comes to us to help them, their motive is either financial or competitive. The nonprofit, this company, when they came to us, their motive was moral. They said, we want to be able to raise the wages for our caregivers. How do we do that in a profitable way? Yes? Okay, I'm sorry. Sorry.
I wanted you to comment on two things: cultural norms and wage differentials between top and bottom. Just to give examples of that, I happen to live in Switzerland, and there's a very strong cultural norm there that everyone should have a living wage, and so there's a bargain. Things are more expensive, but basically everyone has good wages. On the other side, your Jamie Dimon example / Costco example together. I used to work at JP Morgan, just full disclosure. But in terms of, there used to be a view that in essence, the top person shouldn't get more than, let's say, 25 times the lowest employee in terms of wage differentials. And you didn't mention either of those as part of the good job strategy, and wanted to
I'm
hear
just
what
an
you thought about that.
operations professor. I mean, I'm just an operations person. I work here, but I'll tell you, not as an academic, I haven't studied the wage gaps, but I'll tell you my views. Something that's very interesting, when we look at the leaders at the top, we have no trouble paying them their contribution. We say, wow, this person did a great job. Shouldn't we pay them what they contributed to our environment? But when it comes to frontline or managers, we don't pay them their contribution. We just pay them market wages. Right? So there's a disconnect between how we think about pay for the top versus for an average worker. And I agree with you. It's out of whack. And hopefully it will correct at some point. In terms of social, and this is related to the social norms too, because it is so acceptable for leaders to be paid that much. In terms of our culture, I wish that everyone paid more attention to this. I was on a panel with a CEO of a restaurant chain, local restaurant chain in Boston. And he said, my customers are so conscientious about the environment. And they want to know how the chickens that we serve, how they were treated, all these things. And he goes, but no one cares that some of my employees used to sleep in their cars. And I think as a society, we have to start paying attention to this and say, you know what? I'm going to shop at places that does take care of their employees. And not choose others. And by the way, we don't have to pay more to be able to do that. It just takes a lot more effort to identify. Glassdoor is one place where you can identify, these things. But I fully agree with you. Yes.
Yeah, hi, I'm Marjan Garamani. Thank you so much for sharing your passion around good job strategies. I was wondering if any of your work has been around creating an inclusive culture for individuals with disabilities. As an underserved community, there's been a lot of research around how it's not only the right thing to do, but it's good for business. So I was curious to see if you've had any work around that.
That is a really important topic. I have not done any work on it. But that is not to say it's not an important topic, so I can't say about either, from a moral point of view, of course. From an economic point of view, I don't know. But yes. Oh, here, yes.
Hi,
Here and there.
thank you for sharing. And my question is, for my experience, there have been, every organization is very profit-driven. So when you have two options, one is probably improving the system, improving the infrastructure, but doesn't bring any sales revenue for the company, it is always viewed as less important versus something else that is immediately profit and revenue generating. So I was wondering, from your experience and your research, are there any practical ways that we can maybe, bring to attention the issues that have to be addressed in an organization, and changing mindset of people, the leaders, so that they're more interested in investing in the people in the longer term. Yeah.
I think there's always a lot of temptation to, especially when you're under performance pressure, to cut costs in places that are very easy to cut costs. And that could be related to your employees, or it could be related to your customers. Right? And oftentimes there's this dynamic where, when you cut costs, that's very immediate. You see the effect on your profit right away, but then the costs associated with that are longer term, it's hard to articulate, it's hard to quantify. And of course, we are wired to emphasize the short term over the long term as human beings, right? That's something that people have shown before. So what can be done about this? One of the things that some of the good job strategies companies do is that they clearly articulate who comes first when they have to make decisions. So if you go to Costco, which is a public company, right? So this is not a privately held company. Every warehouse, you will see their prioritization. The number one is obey the law. So 100% of the time, they're going to obey the law. But then they have customer first, employees second, supplier third, investors, shareholders the last. And by being able to do this, sticking to this prioritization, they have been able to create a lot more value to their shareholders. But the reason they do this and they stick to it 100% of the time is it's just so tempting to cut on the customer or to cut on the employees when you're under performance pressure. And putting this prioritization and putting this constraint that's values-based says, when you're under performance pressure, okay, I can't take benefits away from my people. I can't take recognition plans from my people. Like, I can't do all those things. How else can I innovate? Southwest Airlines is a great example of this, right? Southwest Airlines has this no layoff policy. And after 9/11, I think almost every airline, with the exception of Southwest and some other airline, they laid off their workers. I think about 16% of the whole workforce was laid off afterward. Southwest did not lay off, but they went to their employees and they said, help us lower costs. Come up with ideas to help us lower costs. And by the way, those ideas stay with you for forever, right? As opposed to the temporary layoffs. So they have these values, they have these principles, and they stick to them. Not 90% of the time, not 95% of the time, but 100% of the time. And that's what really makes a value a value.
Yeah. I have the microphone. Actually, this is a follow-up on the comment you just made about Costco, about their priorities. And recently, several CEOs, Dimon included, made a statement. I forgot what the statement
Yes,
is
the Business
called.
Roundtable.
Right, Business Roundtable about the management's responsibilities is not limited. Or when I was in school, I remember professors told us management responsibility is to maximize shareholder value. I remember at the time I was asking myself, that's kind of strange. So what about the employees? And there are a lot of stakeholders. I'm just wondering, in light of that statement, are there any companies reached out? Because this is clearly employees as part of the stakeholder. Yep. And to reformulate your findings in the context of stakeholder maximizing all stakeholder values or propositions.
Yeah, I guess the short answer is yes, some leaders have reached out. But a slightly longer answer to your question is like, it's great that they came up with that statement. It's wonderful. Let's see what happens. I mean, it's so easy to put a statement like that. Like, let's see if we see raises in wages in any of these companies that went behind the statement, right? They see if we see any benefits. So I think it's just easy to put things on a piece of paper, but it needs to be accompanied by some action. And I'm still a little bit skeptical in that. Okay, who has the microphone? I see the hands. But.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much. I've learned so much from what you've said today. And my question is, as we see a lot of these, even retail companies have digital strategies as well, and have, maybe some workers be remote. Do the strategies that you discussed before, the 4 operational strategies, do they change as you start to see, do they change when you look at the business units that are on the ground, brick and mortar, versus maybe some of the digital businesses these organizations have? Or if you start to look at remote workers, for example?
Yeah, I have not looked at the remote workers. It's an interesting thing. I have not looked at, because I have looked at the organizations where a group of people get together to accomplish a goal. In that setting, that's why cross-training, et cetera, is important. I haven't extended beyond the remote workers, but that would be an interesting area to look into. I think I'm done. One more. Okay, one more. Okay.
All right. Actually, I have the microphone.
Okay.
So
I'm here afterwards, so I'm happy to speak outside.
So I work in Silicon Valley, and there's been a lot of press this year about contract workers. Mm-hmm. Google has more contractors than permanent employees. A lot of commentary about Lyft and Uber riding on the backs of contractors. a lot of exposés about Facebook moderators who are contract workers. How does what you're doing apply to some of the most powerful companies in our economy that are sitting in tech?
Again, it's contract workers is not some area, but can I just make a common, a general view about the Silicon Valley mentality and how this feeds into the good job strategy and what we're seeing? Because contract workers, I mean, you can see them, maybe even some of the part-time workers in retail are just like contract workers because they're working 13 hours a week. I mean, they come and go, and they're not really part of the organization. They don't have benefits. Of course, legally, they're separate. But I think one of the things that Silicon Valley did us much favor in terms of these jobs is that when you think about an organization that needs to create good jobs, that needs to have good management practices, and that needs to have good management, that doesn't work with exponential growth. Like, we have been so obsessed during the last 10, 15 years with companies that just grow so fast. You can't, if you're hiring 10,000 workers a day, you're going to make lots of mistakes. If you're opening new facilities every month, you're not going to have good managers opening those facilities who know how to coach their people, who know how to develop their people, who know how to provide good feedback. That's just not going to happen. And I think that super fast growth mentality has been one of the, and that's what we celebrate now, right? That's what we celebrate. And it worked with bytes, like scalability, but with atoms and with people, like, it's much harder to do that amazing scalability. And I think, I'm hoping that with all the, when you look at the other thing is, of course, apart from Facebook and Google, none of these companies are making money either. So it's a very interesting situation where investors have been very patient with them while they make no money. So I'm hoping that we will reverse to the times where we valued management practices. We valued good management, and we valued profitability. So thank you very much. I hope you had a good time.